The match is struck, and for a moment there are two fires, the real one at the end of the matchstick, and its twin rising up from the mirror's surface below. When the candle catches and the match is shaken out, the doubling holds. One flame sits on the edge of the sink, small and slightly unsteady in the air displaced by the closing door. The other floats inside the glass, suspended in a darkness that has no floor, burning with the same soft pulse as the one that made it. The bathroom is very dark otherwise. The door is closed. From the other side of it, nothing yet. This is the room where it happens. It has always been a bathroom, or nearly always, a room small enough that the mirror takes up most of one wall, private enough that the ritual requires a closed door, dark enough that the candle is the only thing between the person standing there and complete visual dissolution. The particulars of the room change across decades and geography and the shifting preferences of children who have passed the instructions from one to another in handwriting that softened at the fold lines from being carried in a pocket. The candle is sometimes a birthday candle, sometimes a tall white taper taken from a kitchen drawer. The mirror is sometimes the medicine cabinet above the sink, sometimes a full-length door mirror, sometimes a compact held in one hand. What does not change across any of the hundreds of documented accounts collected by folklorists working in the American Midwest and South from the late 1960s onward is the darkness, the mirror, and the name said aloud to the glass. Janet Langlois and Alan Dundes, both of whom studied the Bloody Mary ritual as a documented feature of American children's folklore, described it as a fixture of pre-adolescent culture, and specifically of the culture of girls, appearing consistently in collected accounts from slumber parties, school nights, neighborhood gatherings in backyards and basements, wherever a group of girls between the ages of 9 and 14 had access to a darkened room with a mirror and enough collective courage to push one member of the group inside. The word fixture is appropriate. These rituals were not rare experiments conducted by unusual children. They were ordinary, repeated, widely distributed, and carried forward by the same informal social infrastructure that carried jump rope rhymes, hand-clapping games, and the words to songs that no adult seemed to have taught anyone. They traveled horizontally through children's peer networks, generation to generation, with the efficiency and the persistence of things that are genuinely useful to the people who carry them. What the ritual was useful for is a question worth holding loosely, while the ritual itself is described more precisely. The structure is simple. A participant enters a darkened bathroom alone. She faces the mirror. She says the name, which is most often Bloody Mary, though the variations are many and documented, a set number of times. She waits, or she looks, or both. Something happens, or seems to happen, or is reported to have happened. She exits the bathroom. The group waiting outside the door receives her account. The ritual is over, and it is also immediately available to whoever is willing to go next. The number of times the name is chanted varies more than almost any other element of the ritual across the documented record. 3 repetitions appear frequently in accounts collected from Midwestern and Southern states, which Langlois noted in her fieldwork from Indiana and neighboring areas. 13 also appears with notable regularity, particularly in accounts where the number itself is understood to carry significance, 13 being a number already loaded with accumulated association for the children who chose it, a number that felt right for this purpose in a way that needed no explanation. These two numbers, 3 and 13, account for the majority of documented versions, but they are far from the only variants in the collected record. 7 appears in some accounts, 9 in others, and in a variant documented in urban school settings, the number escalates dramatically, with 100 repetitions recorded as the standard for a version of the ritual, understood explicitly as an endurance test, a demonstration of sustained commitment to the dare rather than a brief plunge into darkness and back. That version is interesting as a social artifact. The same basic structure expanded until the element of waiting becomes as much the point as the element of fear. The person inside the bathroom chanting to a mirror for long enough that the experience of the darkness becomes something to be endured rather than simply entered. The candle placed on the edge of the sink or on a shelf or held in the participant's free hand bends its flame slightly each time the person standing before it shifts their weight. This is a small thing, but it is worth pausing on because the unstable quality of candlelight is not incidental to the ritual. It is structural. The flame is not still. The light it throws across the mirror's lower half moves with it, contracting and expanding across the reflective surface in a rhythm that follows the participant's own breathing and movement. The ellipse of warm light that reaches the mirror changes shape. The shadow it casts above the mirror's midpoint shifts. The face reflected in that glass is lit from below and from one side, and it is lit inconsistently, which means the face in the mirror is always slightly different from one moment to the next, the shadows deepening and releasing, the familiar features rearranging themselves in small and technically meaningless ways that the person watching them cannot quite track in real time. This is the setting in virtually every documented version. The darkness is considered essential, not atmospheric. Electric lighting turned on would invalidate the ritual, as the children who performed it understood it, would make the whole thing simply a person standing in front of a mirror saying words, which is not the same thing at all. The darkness and the single candle are load-bearing elements of the structure, not decorations. They create the specific conditions under which the ritual's reported effects become possible. Folklorist Elizabeth Tucker, collecting post-experience accounts from participants over many years, found consistent descriptions of the mirror producing something unexpected, a face that was not quite the participant's own face, or the participant's face changing expression without the participant's conscious direction, or a figure standing behind the reflected person in the glass, something dimly perceived at the edge of the candle's reach, where the darkness was still almost complete. Tucker's collected accounts are careful and various. The children who gave them were not describing identical experiences. One girl described her reflection's eyes as having moved without her moving her eyes. Another described the face in the mirror going wrong in a way she could not specify further. Just wrong, different, not hers anymore. A third described turning to check whether anyone had entered the bathroom behind her and finding no one, the bathroom door still closed, the room empty except for herself and the candle and the continuing darkness. What unites the accounts is not the specific content of what was perceived, but the quality of the perception itself, something real and present and unexpected, produced by the conditions of the ritual, reported consistently enough across geography and decade that the consistency itself is the interesting finding. There is a house somewhere in Indiana in the early 1970s, carpeted in a color that no longer exists as a decorative choice, and in the living room of that house, a group of girls has arranged itself on sleeping bags in the way that slumber parties arrange themselves, loosely, with the sense that the night is long and has not yet found its shape. One of them is about to disappear through the bathroom door. The others are pressing close to the hallway, not inside the bathroom, careful to observe the boundary the ritual requires. The girl who goes in takes the candle from whoever has been holding it. The door closes. In the hallway, the remaining girls go still, in a way that is itself a form of participation, a kind of attentiveness that holds the ritual together from the outside, while the person inside holds it together from within. What comes next belongs to the room behind the door. What comes after that, when the door opens again, belongs to the whole group. This social structure is worth holding in mind as clearly as the physical one. The Bloody Mary ritual is not, in any of its documented forms, a solo practice. It is performed alone, but witnessed collectively, and the collective witness is as constitutive of the ritual as the darkness and the mirror. The girl going through the bathroom door does so in full awareness that she will be expected to come back with something to report. The group waiting in the hallway already shares a framework for what that report might contain, assembled from prior accounts, past instructions, the general texture of what this ritual is known to do. They are not a passive audience. They are participants in every sense except the one that requires going through the door, and their presence shapes the experience of the person who does go through it in ways that are not trivial. The name Bloody Mary is the most widely documented version in the collected record from the 1970s onward, but it was not always the name attached to the ritual, and in many regional variants it still is not. Langlois's fieldwork in Indiana documented the name Mary Worth, and in some accounts Mary Worthington, appearing more frequently than Bloody Mary in Midwestern school communities, at least through the period of her study. Southern collections show Mary Worth as well, but also Hail Mary, a variant that carries a different register, harder and more direct, and that appears in accounts from parts of the South where the ritual seems to have developed its own local character, independent of the more widely distributed Mary Worth tradition. The names are varied, and the variations are documented, but what persists across every regional variant is the basic requirement, a name, said aloud, to a mirror in the dark, a specified number of times. The instructions for the ritual traveled most often in written form, or in spoken form precise enough to have been written down and copied. A folded piece of paper, carried in a school pocket until the fold lines went soft, specifying the number of repetitions and the requirement for a single candle. This is one of the cleaner images from the collected material, the kind of transmission object that makes the oral folkloric tradition visible as an actual physical practice rather than an abstraction. Somebody wrote the instructions down. Somebody else copied them, or passed the original, or repeated them carefully enough that the copy that traveled 2 towns over still specified 13 repetitions and a candle and nothing else, the essential elements preserved through the transmission, even as the paper itself wore. Southern versions of the ritual contain a variant element not found in Midwest collections with the same frequency, the instruction to spin in place before opening one's eyes to the mirror. In these versions, the participant enters the bathroom, closes the door, lights the candle if it has not already been lit, and then rotates in place, sometimes a specific number of rotations, sometimes continuously through the chant itself, before stopping to face the glass. The spinning introduces a physical dimension to the ritual that the stationary Midwestern versions do not include, and it also introduces a predictable physical effect, after rotation in the dark, with only a candle for reference. The eyes and the vestibular system are not in agreement about the room's position, and the mirror, when it comes into view in a body that is slightly disoriented, that has just rearranged its relationship to the space around it. The face in the mirror arrives for these participants in a different physical state than it arrives for participants who have been standing still. The candle burns, the door stays closed. The girls in the hallway wait. These are the constants across the documented record, and they have been the constants for long enough that folklorists working in the 1970s and 1980s were already collecting accounts describing practices that felt old, that participants described as having been around forever, as something older girls had taught them, as something their older sisters had done. The ritual had no identifiable origin point that any collector could locate. It simply was already established, already distributed, already possessed of a stable core structure and a peripheral range of regional variation when the scholarship began to reach it. New England added its own variations to this peripheral range, and some of them are worth attention because they concern not the ritual's performance, but its setting, the mirror itself. Documented versions from New England communities specify that the mirror used must not be an ordinary bathroom mirror, not any reflective surface that happens to be available. It must be an antique. Or, in a closely related variant, it must be a mirror that has reflected a death, a mirror that was present in a room where someone died, or that hung in a house where a death occurred, or that belonged to a person who has since died. The antique requirement and the death mirror requirement sometimes appear separately and sometimes together, as though they are understood to be two expressions of the same underlying requirement, that the mirror have a history, that it have seen more than the present room, that it carry within its surface the accumulated reflection of some prior world. The Southern practice of using the name Mary Worth or Hail Mary alongside the more specific instruction to spin demonstrates how regional variants develop differently while maintaining the core. The New England mirror requirement demonstrates something different, not a variation in procedure, but a variation in the understanding of what the ritual operates on. In the Midwestern and Southern versions, the mirror is a surface, a medium, the place where the face appears. In the New England variants, the mirror is itself a participant. It brings something to the ritual that a new mirror cannot bring, something accumulated and specific to its own history. The requirement that the mirror be an antique or a death mirror implies that mirrors hold time differently than other objects, that their histories are stored in them in a form that remains accessible under the right conditions, that what a mirror has reflected once, it reflects still, somewhere in the depth of the glass. This is a piece of genuine regional folk belief, not a theatrical embellishment. The children and young people who passed on these New England variants were not being poetic. They were specifying a real requirement for what they understood to be a real procedure. The mirror needed to have the right kind of history, or the ritual would not work, not because the darkness in the name and the candle were insufficient, but because the mirror itself was an active element of what was being attempted, and an ordinary mirror without history was the wrong tool for the job. There is something in this requirement that is worth sitting with for a moment, not because it is unusual in the context of folk belief. Mirrors as repositories of prior experience appear in traditions well beyond New England, but because of the way it reframes the object at the center of the ritual. A mirror with history is different from a mirror without one. The glass that hung in a bedroom where someone died in 1943 carries 1943 in it, somehow, in some form that the folk logic of the New England tradition treated as real and material and relevant to what a person standing before it in the dark might find there. The face reflected back might not be only the face of the person looking. It might be something older, something from the mirror's prior life, something the glass had been holding since before the person standing before it was born. The idea that a mirror might carry a history inside it is not, in context, a difficult one to arrive at. A mirror does carry a kind of history in the most ordinary physical sense. Its surface records the scratches and fogging and small imperfections of years of use. Herb, the precise quality of its silver backing changes with age. The way old mercury-backed mirrors hold light is different from the way modern silvered glass holds it. The reflections in antique mirrors have a quality slightly warmer, very slightly less precise, that is visually distinct from the reflections in new ones. The folk requirement for an old mirror or a death mirror is not disconnected from observation. Old mirrors look different. Their reflections feel different. The quality of the face they return to the person looking is subtly altered by their age and their history in ways that are not imaginary. Whether what the New England tradition believed about this, the accumulated reflection, the stored past, the mirror that holds what it has seen, was true in any further sense than this is not the kind of question the ritual itself addresses. The ritual operates. The instructions are passed along. The requirement for an old mirror, or a mirror that has reflected a death, travels forward through decades, softened at the fold lines from being carried, specific and serious, and intact. The darkness in the bathroom holds the candle's twin fire in the glass. The door is still closed. The face in the mirror, in the deep quiet of a house asleep around it, waits in a dark that is very old and an object whose history goes back further than the room it currently hangs in, further perhaps than anyone in the house could trace. The candle placed on the sink's edge bends its flame whenever someone shifts their weight on the tile. The mirror doubles it. From the other side of the bathroom door, there is silence, and then there will be the sound of the latch, and then the door will swing open, sometimes slowly, sometimes fast enough that the door swings back against the wall, and the candle blows out in the rush of air from the opening, and the girl who went in will come out into the hallway light, bringing with her whatever she found in the glass. Whatever the darkness in the old mirror and the name said 13 times produced for her in the space where the ritual operates. What she says, then, becomes part of the record. It joins the accumulated account, the informal archive built from 1,000 bathroom doors, opening onto 1,000 halogen-lit or lamp-lit hallways, where a group of girls leans slightly forward to hear what happened in the dark. The instructions go back into the pocket. The candle is found and relit or abandoned, depending on whether anyone else is willing to go. The night continues. The ritual continues too, across more decades than any single participant will live to observe, carried forward by children who will in turn describe it to other children who will find a darkened bathroom and a mirror and a candle and discover for themselves what happens when the conditions are precisely right and the face in the glass begins to do something the face should not be doing. The name changes sometimes. The number of repetitions shifts by region and by decade. The requirement for a spinning approach, or a specific type of mirror, or a mirror with a specific kind of past, varies from one community to the next. What the New England communities knew, or believed they knew, about mirrors is this: that a mirror is not simply a surface, but a container, and that what a container has held, it holds still, at some depth not accessible under ordinary conditions. The death mirror requirement assumes that what the glass reflected during the days of mourning in a house where someone died is still there, somewhere in the silver, waiting for the right hour and the right darkness, and a face looking directly into the right point in the glass to bring it forward again. The antique requirement assumes the same thing in a less specific form, that age itself is a kind of accumulation, that a mirror old enough has simply seen too much to have forgotten all of it, that the years of faces reflected and rooms held in the glass, and light bent and returned across a century or more, have left something in the material that a mirror made last year does not yet possess. This is the mirror the New England ritual requires. An old one that has seen something, one that carries, somewhere in its depth, a history that the person standing before it in the dark might, under precisely the right conditions, be permitted to see. The bathroom is quiet. The candle on the sink burns steadily now that the door is closed and the air has settled. In the mirror, two small fires hold their position, one on the porcelain rim of the sink, one floating in the glass at exactly the same distance below the surface as the real flame is above it. Each one the other's proof, each one burning in a separate world divided by the silver line of the mirror's face. The girls in the hallway are quiet. The house is quiet. The ritual is precisely itself, as it has been for as long as anyone who performs it can remember, and further back than that, and further still, in ways that will take some time to trace. On the morning of July 19th, 1553, the bells of London began to ring. They started in one parish and spread to the next, the sound moving across the city, the way weather moves, one church catching the signal from its neighbor and adding its own voice to the accumulation, until the whole of London was ringing at once. People came out into the streets before they had fully understood why. Tables were carried from houses and set with food and wine in the open air. Bonfires were lit before the afternoon had turned. A chronicler who was present noted that some men were so overcome they could not speak, and that others were crying without knowing that they were crying. What the bells were announcing across all of those parishes simultaneously was that England had a queen. Mary Tudor had been proclaimed sovereign that morning, and the declaration had been made in defiance of a succession dispute that had threatened to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne instead. The circumstances of how she came to power mattered greatly to those who were there, to the people eating and drinking in the streets of London. That afternoon, however, the detail that seemed most significant was simpler than any of the political machinery behind it. England had not had a queen regnant before. No woman had ruled in her own right, held the title as her own, exercised the authority as something not borrowed from a husband. What the bells were ringing in was a thing that had not existed yet. Mary I was 37 years old when she came to the throne. She had spent a significant portion of her adult life in a condition of deliberate political uncertainty, her legitimacy as heir disputed, her status at court reduced, and then restored, and then reduced again across the long, difficult reign of her father, Henry VIII. She had watched the English church remake itself around the arguments of reformers. She had watched her mother, Catherine of Aragon, set aside. She was, by the time those bells began, a woman who had been waiting for a long time. Her reign began in a burst of genuine popular feeling and ended, 5 years later, in a different atmosphere entirely. The distance between those two moments is where her historical reputation was made, and the reputation that was made there is the one that eventually, across several centuries, and by a route that was not direct, attached itself to a ritual performed by children in darkened bathrooms. The name came first, and the name is worth examining on its own terms before anything else is considered. Bloody Mary. The epithet is so fixed now, so thoroughly cemented to the historical figure, that it can seem as though the name and the queen arrived together. They did not. Mary died on November 17th, 1558, and the name as a stable piece of historical shorthand belongs primarily to the decades that followed, shaped by the forces that were, by then, already at work on her memory. The most significant of those forces was a book. John Foxe was an English Protestant clergyman who had spent Mary's reign in exile on the European continent. He returned after her death under the Protestant queen who followed her, and in 1563 he published the first edition of a work that eventually became known as Acts and Monuments, though it was widely referred to by the shorter title that described what it contained, the Book of Martyrs. It was a large, expensive, illustrated volume, printed in dense columns, full of accounts of Protestant men and women who had been tried for heresy during Mary's reign and executed, most commonly by burning at the stake. The woodcut illustrations showed the fires, they showed the crowds, they showed the faces of the condemned in the moment before the flames reached them. The book was reprinted and expanded several times across the following decades, and it was eventually ordered to be displayed in every cathedral in England, placed where any person who came in could read it. What it did to Mary's historical reputation was considerable, and in the view of later historians, not entirely fair. The historical figure of Mary I burned approximately 284 Protestants at the stake during her reign. The first of these executions took place at Smithfield in February 1555, when a clergyman named John Rogers was led out and burned before a large crowd that included, by some accounts, his wife and children. The number 284 is the figure that modern historians have worked with, and it is not a small number. Historian David Loades, who spent much of his career studying Mary's reign in detail, was careful to note that the scale of the persecution, while genuine and serious, was not outside the range of what religious violence looked like in 16th century Europe more broadly. The Spanish Inquisition, operating across the same period, executed heretics in comparable numbers. The French monarchy in 1572 presided over the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, in which thousands of Huguenots were killed in a single August weekend. What distinguished Mary's persecution in the historical record was not its scale alone, but the fact that Fox documented it so thoroughly, so visually, and distributed that documentation so widely, in a country that was, by the time the books were being read, governed by Protestants who had strong reasons to preserve the memory. The Bloody Mary of historical legend, the queen defined entirely by those fires, is substantially a product of Fox's framing. That framing was not invented from nothing. The executions happened, the people died, the records exist. But the nickname, the reduction of an entire complex reign to those 5 years and those 284 deaths, was the work of Protestant memory making, and it was extremely effective work. It produced a figure so stark and so defined that she could travel across centuries without losing her outline, could pass from historical memory into cultural shorthand, and eventually into folklore without requiring anyone to know anything specific about her. She was a queen who burned people. That was the shape of her in popular memory, and the shape was portable. For before she was that shape, though, she was a person with a reign, and the reign contained more than the fires. Mary married Philip II of Spain on July 25th, 1554, in Winchester Cathedral. The marriage was deeply unpopular. Parliament had debated it at length and reluctantly permitted it, attaching conditions designed to limit Philip's power in English affairs. Philip was 11 years younger than Mary and had been married before. He spoke no English. He stood at the altar of Winchester Cathedral as a stranger in a country that did not want him there, in a marriage that was being negotiated around him as much as with him. A contemporary observer noted that the naive had been fitted out magnificently for the occasion, and that the congregation's mood was harder to read. The marriage produced nothing that its supporters had hoped for. It did not produce an heir. It did not secure a lasting alliance with Spain on terms that benefited England. What it produced in the end was a military entanglement that cost England more than it could afford. When Philip's war with France drew England in, the French took Calais in January of 1558, ending more than 200 years of English presence on the European continent. Calais had been English since 1347. Its loss was not easily absorbed, and it fell during Mary's reign, under a queen married to a Spanish king who had drawn her into a war that was not England's to fight. The sense of the reign ending badly, of a queen who had made choices that damaged the country she loved, was not simply Protestant propaganda. It was also the judgment of people who had been hoping she would succeed. Mary died on November 17th, 1558. She was 42 years old. The illness that killed her was most likely influenza or uterine cancer, though the precise diagnosis across a distance of 5 centuries is uncertain. She had been ill for some time before the end. What she had not done, and what she seems to have understood she had not done as the illness progressed, was leave the country in the condition she had hoped. She had hoped to restore England to the Roman Catholic faith permanently. She had hoped to provide a Catholic heir. Neither of those things had happened. There had been 2 pregnancies, or what the court and the country had been told were pregnancies, during her reign. The first was announced in late 1554, shortly after her marriage to Philip. Preparations were made. A cradle was commissioned. Draft announcements of the birth were prepared and held ready. Ladies of the court gathered around the queen. Mary herself, by the accounts of those present, was certain. By the summer of 1555, the certainty had slowly and then completely dissolved. No child was born. The swelling that had been read as pregnancy resolved, and the doctors and the court and the foreign ambassadors, who had been sending careful reports home about the impending birth for months, found that there was nothing to report. A second episode followed. The symptoms returned, or something was read as their return, and the same preparations began again. This pregnancy also ended without a child. What caused these episodes is a question that cannot be answered cleanly from this distance. The possibilities that historians have considered include false pregnancy, a condition in which the body produces many of the physical signs of pregnancy in the absence of a developing child, as well as uterine or ovarian tumors whose growth could have produced similar presentations. What is documented is the external record, the preparations made, the announcements drafted, the court's belief, the court's withdrawal from that belief, and the absence at the end of both episodes of any child at all. A commissioned cradle sitting in a quiet room. That image has stayed in historical memory, not because it is the most dramatic fact of her reign, but because it contains the particular kind of sadness that belongs to something carefully prepared for a future that did not arrive. Mary had waited a long time to be queen. She had waited a long time for a great many things. The cradle was one of the most visible forms of that waiting, and it came to nothing in a room that had been prepared for something else entirely. This is the woman whose name eventually floated free of her history and began its long journey toward a darkened bathroom and a candle and a mirror. The journey, however, was not direct, and the scholarship on how it happened is careful to say so. Alan Dundas was a folklorist at the University of California, Berkeley, whose work on the structure and transmission of folk legend was thorough enough to have influenced the field substantially. He wrote about the Bloody Mary ritual with the attention he brought to all folklore, careful about what could be established, careful about what was being assumed, and specifically careful about the assumption that a name attached to a ritual must represent the origin of that ritual. His conclusion, reached after examining the documented variants of the ritual and the historical evidence for any connection between the queen and the mirror summoning, was that the connection was extremely tenuous, not merely uncertain, extremely tenuous. The particular phrasing matters because it is more definitive than it might sound from a scholar trained to be precise about levels of evidence. What Dundas concluded, essentially, was that the ritual came first, the name came later, the name Bloody Mary, which had circulated in Protestant historical memory for 3 centuries by the time American children were chanting it in darkened bathrooms, was a culturally available epithet, recognizable, associated with a vague sense of danger and female malevolence that found its way onto a ritual structure that had been developing independently of any historical queen. The ritual was not invented to summon Mary Tudor. Mary Tudor's name was borrowed to give the ritual a label that felt appropriately ominous. This kind of movement happens in folklore regularly enough that it has a name. The process by which a free-floating legend, one that exists as a general structure without a fixed identity attached to it, acquires the name of a historical figure is called legend accretion. The name is borrowed because it fits the emotional shape of the story, not because it describes the story's origin. The Bloody Mary ritual had an emotional shape, dark, female, dangerous, connected to mirrors and death, and the name Bloody Mary had a similar emotional shape. They fit together well enough that the attachment was made, and made many times over by many different children in many different places, until the name seemed permanent. It was not permanent in the sense of being original. It was permanent in the sense of being, by the time folklorists began documenting it, already old enough that no individual child who used the name could trace the moment of attachment. The documented variants of the ritual that were collected before the Queen's name became dominant are worth pausing on, because they show the ritual in its state before the historical attachment was complete. Fieldwork conducted in the Midwest in the 1970s turned up versions in which the figure being summoned was not a queen at all. She was Mary Worthing. She was Mary Worthington. She was a woman who had been hanged for witchcraft, or burned, or who had died in front of the mirror and stayed there. She was described by the children who knew her not in terms of history, but in terms of folklore. A woman in old clothes, a woman who wanted to hurt you, a woman whose presence in the mirror was something that had been in the mirror for a long time, waiting. That figure, the woman in old clothes who was hanged and came back, is substantially different from a 16th century English queen, even a queen with a reputation for burning people. The historical Mary Tudor was a monarch engaged in a religious persecution that had complex theological and political dimensions. The Mary of those 1970s fieldwork accounts was a witch, a wronged woman, a spirit of female rage and dangerous knowledge. The two figures share a name and a gender and a general aura of threat, but they do not share a history, and the folklore does not require them to. Folklore does not require its figures to have accurate biographies. It requires them to carry the right emotional weight. What the name Bloody Mary carried, once it arrived in the ritual, was the weight of centuries of Protestant memory, a weight that had been accumulating since Fox printed his first edition and set the Queen's outline in the public imagination as a woman defined by fire and blood. That outline was dark enough and stable enough and widely enough known that it could be dropped onto an existing ritual structure and hold the figure the children were summoning was not the historical queen, but the name they were using had been carrying the historical queen's reputation for 300 years, and that reputation had done something to the name that made it useful, a label finding its jar after the jar has already been made. The image is a good one for what actually seems to have happened, and it resists the tidier story that would connect the queen directly to the ritual. The tidier story that children chant Bloody Mary's name because Mary Tudor burned Protestants, and her ghost is therefore associated with mirrors and fire and death, is the kind of story that sounds plausible when repeated but does not survive the specific evidence. The evidence is that the name arrived late, that the ritual existed without it, and that the emotional logic connecting them is associative rather than historical. That is not a deflation of the legend. A name traveling across 5 centuries and finding its way into the mouths of children in darkened bathrooms is a more interesting journey than a simple origin story would be. It says something about how language carries emotional residue, about how a reputation can outlive its context, about how the word bloody, attached to a queen's name in the grief of Protestant martyrology, could still carry enough weight in the 1970s to make a ritual feel more serious than it would have under a different name. Mary's reputation had legs, as the historians say. Philip II, the husband who stood at the Winchester Cathedral altar in 1554, not speaking English, outlived Mary by 41 years. He ruled Spain until 1598. He sponsored the Armada that would attempt to invade England in 1588, the attempt that failed famously in the gray waters of the Channel, and he spent much of his long reign trying to hold together an empire that was, in the view of later historians, already beginning to exceed what any single administrative structure could manage. Whatever he had hoped the English marriage would produce, it did not produce it. He left England after Mary died and did not return. The marriage, for him, was one of several diplomatic arrangements, not all of them successful. For Mary, it was the central relationship of her adult life, deeply felt, genuinely important to her, and ultimately unable to give her what she most needed. The loss of Calais fell in January of 1558. Mary is reported to have said, in her last months, that when she died, the word Calais would be found written on her heart. Whether she said this is disputed, the attribution appears in sources written after her death, and may be a legend that formed around her grief, but it has persisted because it captures something that seems emotionally consistent with what the records show of her in those final months. A queen who had tried to restore what had been lost, and who was dying without having managed it. The Protestantism she had worked to root out had survived her. The Catholic heir she had tried to provide had not arrived. The England she left behind was the England her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth would inherit and govern for the next 45 years. The work of Mary's reign was, from her own perspective, undone almost immediately. That is a particular kind of historical fate, to work hard at something, to believe in it completely, and to have it reversed before the year of your death is finished. None of this, in the view of the scholarly consensus, connects directly to children chanting a name in a dark bathroom, but none of it is irrelevant either. A name carries the emotional content of what it has been used to describe, and the emotional content that had accumulated around the name Bloody Mary by the time it reached American children's folklore was substantial. It meant fire. It meant a queen who had used power in ways that left a dark impression. It meant something female and powerful and punishing, which is a combination of qualities that the ritual was already organized around before the queen's name arrived. The name was not the origin of anything. It was a late addition to a structure that had been built by other hands, for other reasons, over a much longer period of time. That structure and those other reasons go back much further than the 16th century. They go back past the printing press, past the Reformation, past the medieval church, past the Roman world that encountered Christianity, back to something older and quieter and more widely distributed than any of those. But before any of that can be considered, it is worth staying for a moment longer with the historical figure herself, not with the legend, not with the ritual, not with the borrowed name, but with the specific woman who was proclaimed queen on July 19th, 1553, while the bells of London rang and people set tables of food in the streets and wept in ways they couldn't explain. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. She had been declared illegitimate and then legitimized again. She had spent years watching the faith she was raised in being dismantled around her, the monasteries dissolved, the Mass abolished, the Latin liturgy replaced with English services whose theological foundations she found genuinely wrong. She was not cruel by temperament. The historians who have examined her most carefully, including Lodes, note that she was in many ways a conscientious ruler who was attempting to govern according to genuine convictions. The persecutions were not sadistic pleasure. They were, in her understanding, the work of a queen protecting souls from heresy by destroying the bodies that carried it, which was the theological logic of her time and her faith, however terrible its application. That framing does not redeem the 284 deaths. It does nothing to reduce what those deaths were, but it places the queen inside her historical moment rather than outside it, which is the only accurate way to look at any historical figure. She was shaped by the world she had lived through. So was Fox, who shaped the world's memory of her. So were the children who would eventually chant her name, not knowing anything about any of this, knowing only that the name was appropriate for what the ritual required. The name detached from the history the way a seed detaches from a plant. It carried the right conditions for what it would eventually become, even though the plant that produced it had long since been winter-killed and forgotten. Fox printed the image of the fires, and the image circulated, and the word bloody accumulated around the name, and the name floated forward through Protestant cultural memory, simplified and reduced until it was available for other uses. It arrived centuries later at a ritual structure that was already waiting for it. Alan Dundas put it plainly enough. The name attached itself to a ritual that already existed. The ritual was not created for the name, and the name did not create the ritual. They found each other the way a label finds a jar long after the jar was made. The jar already shaped, already containing what it would always contain, simply waiting for something to read. What the jar contained, and how long it had been sitting there, and what kinds of hands had carried it through the centuries before any queen's name was written on it. Those are questions with their own long answers. The bells of London that rang on the morning of July 19th, 1553, rang across a city that already had mirrors, already had folk beliefs about mirrors, already had the kinds of stories that gather around reflective surfaces in the dark. Those beliefs were old when Mary was proclaimed queen, older than the English church in any of its forms, older than the printing press that would eventually distribute Fox's account of her reign across every cathedral in the country. The Queen's name arrived late to a conversation that had been going on for a very long time, and it arrived as a label, not an origin. That is the honest account of what connected her, or failed to connect her, to a candle on a bathroom sink and a face in the dark glass. The name traveled. The jar was already there. A cord goes taut over the edge of the stone basin, and then, by a careful hand, it goes slack. The mirror descends. The water at the sanctuary near Patras was cold enough in the 2nd century to hold its stillness even when disturbed, and for a few moments the surface would fracture and shift before settling again into that particular flatness that deep, still water finds. The mirror hung just below the surface. Its face was turned downward, toward whatever the spring held in its dark lower reaches, and the sick person kneeling at the edge waited for the water to still completely, so that the reflection could be read. Pausanias, the Greek geographer who recorded this practice sometime around 150 CE, described it with the same even attention he gave to temples, road distances, and the locations of olive groves. It was not for him remarkable in the way that it might seem remarkable now. A person who was ill came to the sanctuary of Demeter. They tied a small mirror to a length of cord. They lowered it into the sacred spring and waited for the reflection to show them whether they would recover or die. The spring told them something. They went home or they did not. What the practice carried inside it was an assumption so old that Pausanias did not feel the need to state it plainly. A reflective surface held at the right angle, in the right place, under the right conditions, shows not only what is in front of it, but what is below it, behind it, and what has not happened yet. That assumption did not begin at Patras. It did not begin in the 2nd century. By the time anyone thought to write it down, it had already been held so long and in so many places that it arrived in every recorded tradition already ancient. The cord goes slack. The mirror hangs suspended just below the water's surface, its face turned downward into the dark. What it shows is the question. What the questioner hopes for is an answer legible enough to carry home. The practice at Patras was not an isolated curiosity in the ancient world. It was one instance of a pattern that turns up wherever people kept records of what they believed. Across the ancient Mediterranean, reflective surfaces, still water, polished bronze, obsidian, and later glass held a consistent and specific meaning. They showed the world as it was, and also, under certain conditions, the world as it was beneath ordinary visibility. The logic was not superstition in the dismissive sense. It had its own internal coherence. A reflection is already a kind of threshold. What you see in a mirror is not the thing itself, but its double, reversed and dimensionless, existing in a space that cannot be entered. That space was understood, in many traditions, to be real. It was simply on the other side. Polished obsidian mirrors have been found at Neolithic sites in Anatolia, at Çatalhöyük, in contexts that suggest deliberate placement rather than practical use. Whether they functioned ritually cannot be confirmed from the archaeological record alone, but the care with which they were positioned and the domestic contexts in which they appear has led some researchers to propose that the mirror and its double had a social meaning that preceded decoration or vanity, the reflection as a separate thing, as a counterpart, as something that required attention. That idea was apparently present before the cities, before the writing, before anyone recorded what it meant. In Egypt, bronze mirrors appear in burial contexts from the Middle Kingdom onward, placed with the dead in a position that seems intended to allow the deceased continued use of the object. Whether this reflects a practical belief in the afterlife's resemblance to ordinary life, or something more specific about mirrors as objects with their own kind of continuation, is not settled. But the mirrors went into the ground with the people, and that placement was deliberate, and it was repeated across centuries and across social classes in ways that suggest it was understood to matter. The mirror descends, the water settles. These are the same gesture, carried forward from one century to the next, acquiring different explanations without ever quite changing its shape. The superstition that breaking a mirror brings 7 years of bad luck is known well enough that most people in the English-speaking world could recite it without knowing where it came from. What it came from is considerably more interesting than the rule itself. Roman folk belief, as recorded in various sources, held that a mirror captured a portion of the viewer's soul, not metaphorically, but in a way that was understood to be as literal as any other physical fact. The reflection was not merely an image, it was a fragment of the person, held in the glass, continuous with the self in some way that made the mirror's destruction a form of harm. The 7-year period was not arbitrary. Roman cosmological thinking included the belief that the body and soul renewed themselves completely on a 7-year cycle, that at the end of 7 years, whatever damage had been done to the spiritual self would be healed by the cycle's completion. Breaking a mirror thus initiated a 7-year period of spiritual injury that would end not through repair of the object, but through the simple passage of time and the body's own renewal. The bad luck was not a punishment sent from outside. It was a description of an internal condition, the state of a soul that had been fractured alongside the glass and had not yet reached the year in which it would grow back. That belief, carried forward through the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, arrived in the 19th century somewhat stripped of its cosmological context, but intact as a practical warning. Children were told not to break mirrors. The reason given was bad luck, 7 years of it. The reason beneath that reason, the soul in the glass, the cycle of renewal, the specific theology of the fragmented self, had receded far enough that most people who repeated the warning could not have explained where the 7 years came from, or why that number and not another. What survives is the rule. What travels is the shape of the belief, even when the explanation that made it coherent has been lost. That is one of the things mirrors do in folklore. They carry things forward that other containers would not hold. The soul in the glass, the 7 years, the rule that crossed from Latin to English without stopping to explain itself. These things are interesting on their own terms, but they become considerably more so when placed next to the mirror divination practices that developed independently in Britain and America, running alongside the mainstream Christian culture of those places without ever quite being absorbed or expelled. In Victorian-era Britain and America, a specific practice was documented often enough to be considered a genuine folk tradition rather than a literary invention. A young woman, alone, placed a candle on the table before her mirror at midnight. She ate an apple slowly, combing her hair all the while, her eyes fixed on the glass. She was waiting for the face of her future husband to appear over her shoulder in the reflection. The practice was associated especially with Halloween and with the feast of Saint Agnes on January 20th, and its persistence across geographical regions and across different social contexts suggests it drew on something that people found genuinely compelling to try, not merely interesting to hear about. The young woman sat in the near dark. The candle was the only light. Her own face looked back at her from the glass, slightly different by candlelight, slightly unfamiliar, and in the space over her shoulder, the space that in ordinary circumstances holds a familiar room, a familiar wall, a familiar arrangement of ordinary things. She was instructed to wait and see what appeared. What she was asking for was a face. What she was using to ask was a reflective surface, a flame, and the particular vulnerability of the late night hour when the visual system and the sense of what is normal both run at reduced capacity. Whether she saw a face, and what it looked like when she did, is a question the records do not answer with great precision. What the records show is that enough women performed the practice across enough decades that it became a documented element of the culture, something younger women were told about by older ones, something that persisted long enough to be collected by folklorists in the early 20th century as a living tradition rather than a historical artifact. The midnight apple, the candle flame, the dark space over the shoulder in the glass. These are the coordinates of a particular kind of looking, and they recur in the Bloody Mary ritual with a consistency that is not coincidental. The ritual and the divination practice are not the same thing, and the women who performed each of them understood them differently. But the equipment, the conditions, and the thing being watched for occupy very similar territory, and the territory had been inhabited for long enough that by the time anyone tried to trace where it came from, the trail was already old. St. Agnes Eve had its own particular authority in this regard. The feast on January 20th was associated in British folk tradition with a range of practices by which young women sought to learn the identity of their future husbands, and mirror divination was only one of several methods documented in the folk literature. What distinguished the mirror practice from the others was its requirement for total stillness, darkness, and direct prolonged gaze, conditions that, as later research would establish, reliably produce perceptual experiences in any face that holds them long enough. The tradition did not know this. It did not need to know it. The women who sat before the mirror on St. Agnes Eve were operating inside a belief system that interpreted what they saw as revelation, that the revelation was also, in a precise and describable way, a product of the conditions under which they looked, does not make it less interesting and does not make their experience less real. It makes the practice more interesting and the experience exactly as real as they found it. The apple eaten slowly, the hair combed in the flickering light, the patient, serious attention to the space over the left shoulder where a face that was not yet known might arrive. The practice of covering mirrors during mourning occupies a different part of the same territory. It is documented in traditions so geographically separated and culturally distinct that tracing a single point of origin is not possible, and most researchers have concluded that it arose independently in multiple places from the same underlying logic rather than spreading from one source. Jewish mourning practice, British and Irish folk tradition, German custom, Slavic folk belief, all of them produced, at some point, the instruction to cover the mirrors in a house where someone had died. The explanations vary by tradition, and the variation is itself informative. In some rabbinic commentary, the covering of mirrors during the period of mourning, known as Shiva, is understood as a precaution against demonic entities, which were believed to be especially active and dangerous in a house where death had recently occurred. The mirrors were covered because what they might show, under those conditions, should not be shown. The explanation assumes a world in which mirrors, in proximity to the recently dead, become windows to something that is better left closed. In British and Irish folk traditions, the covering of mirrors was explained differently. The soul of the person who had died, still present in the house in the days immediately after death, might look into a mirror and see its own reflection, and that seeing might trap it there, causing the soul to remain in the glass rather than continuing its journey. The mirrors were covered to give the dead an unobstructed path out of the house. The fear was not for the living, but for the dead. The mirror was a risk to the soul that was trying to leave. In Slavic folk traditions, both explanations appear, sometimes in the same household and the same mourning period, with different family members offering different accounts of why the mirrors were turned to face the wall. What the various explanations share is the premise that a mirror in a house of death is different from a mirror in a house where no death has occurred. Something has changed about the glass, or about what the glass might be continuous with, or about what might look out through it, now that the boundary between the living and the dead has been disturbed in this particular place. The blank wooden backs of the mirrors, the rooms made strange by their absence, the usual surfaces of reflection replaced by surfaces that show nothing, a household going about the specific work of grief in rooms where none of the walls give back an image, where the face cannot check itself against the glass, where the self exists without its double for as long as the mourning requires. That practice is still observed. In Jewish households keeping Shiva, the mirrors are still covered. In some British and Irish rural communities, the custom persists in living memory, if not in active practice. The instruction that a mirror must not reflect during mourning passed from one generation to the next, losing in some cases the explanation that originally accompanied it, surviving as a practice in communities where the explanation had long since been forgotten. The shape of the belief persisted after the theology that supported it had receded, the same way the 7-year rule persisted after the Roman cosmology that made it coherent had disappeared. A mirror turned to face the wall, a mirror lowered on a cord into still water. These are the same mirror, in some sense, both of them understood as surfaces that do something other than merely reflect, and both of them requiring management in the form of covering or angling or lowering, as though the glass must be handled carefully to control what it shows. The scholar Robert Ferris Thompson spent much of his career tracing the intellectual and spiritual inheritance of Central African cultures in the Americas, following the traditions of the Bakongo people of what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo and Republic of Congo across the Atlantic and into the communities that formed under and after the Atlantic slave trade. One of the things he traced was the meaning of reflective surfaces. In Bakongo cosmological understanding, the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead is a horizontal threshold, marked in ceremonial objects and in the cosmograms that express this understanding visually by a mirror surface or by the surface of still water. The living exist above this line. The dead exist below it, in a world that is understood as an exact reflection of the world above, occupying the same space but on the other side of the surface. The mirror does not merely represent this boundary. In ritual contexts, it is this boundary. To look into the glass is, in this framework, to look across the threshold. That understanding traveled. Thompson documented its presence in hoodoo practice in the American South, in Afro-Caribbean religious traditions, in the particular ways that mirrors and water were used in ritual contexts across the communities that descended from those who had been brought from Central Africa across the Atlantic. The belief did not survive intact everywhere it traveled, and in many places it survived in fragmentary or transformed ways, but the basic structure, the mirror as threshold, the reflective surface as the line between the living world and the ancestral world, persisted with a consistency that Thompson found traceable through material culture, through ritual practice, and through the specific physical uses of glass and water in community contexts across several centuries. The cosmogram, drawn in the 19th century, shows it plainly. A horizontal line divides the image into two halves, one above and one below. In the upper half, the living world. In the lower half, the world of the ancestors, rendered as a reflection of the world above. The same forms, the same proportions reversed. The line between them is the mirror surface. The line is still. The line is the threshold. To cross it, or to peer across it, or to hold a reflective surface at that boundary, is to enter into communication with what lives on the other side. Two halves of an image, separated by a line that is a mirror, the upper world and the lower world, exact reflections of each other. And across the Atlantic, in Britain and in ancient Rome, and at the spring at Patras, people who had never encountered the Bakongo cosmogram, and whose traditions had developed entirely independently over entirely separate centuries, arrived at the same line, a mirror surface as a boundary, a reflective surface as the place where the visible and the invisible are closest to each other. The thing in the glass as both image and counterpart, both reflection and something other. The line does not move. The mirror surface is still. On both sides of the Atlantic, separately and without exchange, the same threshold was identified in the same place. That convergence is not a small thing. It is not the result of one tradition borrowing from another. The evidence does not support a single point of origin from which the belief spread outward. What it suggests instead is that something about the experience of looking into a reflective surface, something in the perceptual conditions it creates, in the way a face in a mirror looks almost, but not quite like the face the person inhabiting it knows from inside, made the same interpretation arrive independently in multiple places. The mirror as threshold was not invented. It was noticed. People in very different places, with very different explanatory frameworks, and very different relationships to death and the dead, noticed the same thing about mirrors, and built their understanding of them accordingly. The spring at Patras, the Roman household with the broken glass, the young woman in Victorian England combing her hair at midnight, the mourners covering the mirrors in the front room, the cosmogram with its still horizontal line, all of them understood that a mirror is not simply a surface that shows what is in front of it. All of them understood that looking into a mirror, under the right conditions, was a different kind of looking, more porous, more uncertain, more likely to produce something other than the predictable and the familiar. All of them developed practices around that understanding, and the practices varied enormously in their details while remaining consistent in their basic shape. The mirror required careful handling. The right conditions could make it show something that ordinary conditions could not. What it showed under those conditions was worth attending to. The mirror as ordinary object and the mirror as threshold are not, in these traditions, two different objects. They are the same object, understood in two registers, simultaneously. In most circumstances, on most days, a mirror shows the face that stands before it, nothing more. But in the right light, at the right hour, with the right attention, or the right grief, or the right intention, something else was possible. The single candle, the darkened room, the face that holds its gaze on the glass until the glass begins to do something unexpected. Every element of that combination was present in documented mirror traditions long before anyone attached a specific name to the practice or wrote down rules for how many times to say it. What Pausanias documented at Patras, what the Victorian apple-eating tradition encoded in its specific instructions about darkness and candlelight, what the Bakongo cosmogram expressed in the horizontal still line between worlds. All of it describes the same relationship between a human face and a reflective surface, and the conditions under which that relationship becomes strange. The strangeness was not incidental to any of these practices. It was the point. The point was the threshold. The point was the crossing. The cord goes slack. The mirror hangs in the cold spring water, its face turned down toward the dark. The sick person at the edge of the basin waited, in the 2nd century, for the water to still enough to read. That same waiting, that same stillness, that same attention to a reflective surface held at the edge of ordinary conditions is present in every tradition that treated a mirror as more than glass. The conditions differ. The belief systems that interpret the results differ enormously. The cosmological frameworks that explain what the mirror shows, and why, and to whom, bear almost no resemblance to one another across the different traditions that held them. But the posture is the same. The face before the glass, held still, in the available dark, waiting for the reflection to show something other than the ordinary. That posture is old enough that tracing it to a single origin is not possible. It may simply be older than any record of it, a practice that preceded explanation, a human response to the specific properties of reflective surfaces that arose wherever people had mirrors, and enough quiet to look into them carefully. The mourning customs, the divination practices, the cosmological frameworks, the legends of the soul in the glass, all of them are ways of making sense of something that people kept noticing. The mirror did something under certain conditions. The mirror showed something in the right dark, with the right stillness, to the right kind of attention. The explanations for what it showed were as various as the cultures that developed them. The noticing was consistent. A Bakongo cosmogram's horizontal line is the mirror surface. It divides the living from the dead, the visible from the ancestral, the world as it appears in daylight from the world as it is below that threshold. The line is still. It is understood the same way by people on both sides of the Atlantic who had never met and whose traditions had grown from entirely separate roots. They arrived at the same threshold from different directions, and what they found there was the same line, still dividing, present in the glass wherever there is a glass, and understood the same way in more places and more centuries than any single explanation for it can contain. The mirror at the edge of the spring, the mirror on the wall turned to face the plaster, the mirror in the dim room where a woman sat alone at midnight on St. Agnes Eve, the mirror surface in the cosmogram that marks the place where the living world and the world of the dead lie, pressed against each other, separated by nothing thicker than the surface of still water. All of them are the same line. All of them are the same understanding, arrived at separately from the same noticing. Whatever a mirror shows in the ordinary light of an ordinary room, it shows something different in the conditions that make it a threshold. That difference was noticed and named and carried forward in ways that did not coordinate with each other and did not need to. The line was always there. People simply kept finding it in every century and on every continent where there was light enough to cast a reflection and a person patient enough to hold very still and look. A Michigan school child is sitting across a table from a folklorist in the 1970s, and she is explaining with complete matter-of-fact certainty that the woman in the mirror is not a queen. She is a witch. She wore old clothes, the kind from a long time ago, and she was hanged for what she did, and her name was Mary Worth, and if you said her name in the dark, she would come through the glass and scratch your face. Janet Langlois, who was collecting children's folklore in the American Midwest during those years, noted that the child delivered this account without hesitation or embellishment, in the same tone one might use to describe a school bus route. There was no performance in it. The child was not trying to frighten anyone. She was relaying established fact, the kind that gets passed from older children to younger ones in hallways and at lunch tables and in the back seats of cars, the kind that arrives already complete and does not require the recipient to believe it so much as to receive it and carry it forward. What Langlois found across dozens of accounts collected from children in Indiana and surrounding states was that the figure at the center of the mirror ritual had a remarkably consistent shape. She was a woman. She had died badly and unjustly. She was angry about it. And she lived, or something of her lived, in reflective surfaces, waiting for the conditions that would allow her to cross back through. The specific name varied. The specific crime attributed to her varied, but the shape of the figure held steady. Collection after collection, interview after interview, the way a coastline holds its shape, even as the individual grains of sand that make it up are constantly shifting. What Langlois published in 1980 in the journal Indiana Folklore was a study that identified this figure, known variously as Mary Worth, Mary Worthington, or simply the witch in the mirror, as a fully realized folkloric character in her own right, one that did not depend on any historical person for its coherence and did not require one. Mary Worth was not a misremembered queen. She was not a garbled piece of English history that had drifted across the Atlantic and shed its context on the way. She was a witch, a woman hanged or burned for practicing witchcraft, a figure who had been wronged by the community that killed her and who had returned the wrong with interest. Her story was its own story, complete and self-sufficient, built from the materials of folk imagination rather than historical record. The figure Langlois documented had a long lineage, though that lineage is not the kind you can trace in a single straight line from a source to its mouth. It is more like a groundwater system, fed by many separate sources and surfacing in many separate places, the connections underground and only occasionally visible. To understand where Mary Worth came from, it helps to look at the wider landscape of folklore in which she moves, and at the figures who share her particular combination of qualities: woman, mirror, death, return. Alan Dunn's, whose work on folklore structure had already reshaped how American scholars thought about legend and ritual, looked at the Bloody Mary figure and saw in her the outline of something much older than slumber parties or even witch trials. What he identified was an archetype distributed so widely across European folk tradition that its age can only be estimated, not pinpointed: the crone, the malevolent feminine spirit, the figure who inhabits the edges of the known world, thresholds, reflective surfaces, bodies of water, the spaces between one state and another, and who is especially dangerous to the young, the female, and the unwary. The archetype is not defined by what she looks like, because she looks different in every tradition. It is defined by where she is and what she does. She is always at the edge. She is always the thing that waits at the transition point. She is never safely in the middle of ordinary life, never found in a well-lit kitchen or a busy marketplace. She is at the mirror, at the well, at the door between the house and the dark outside, at the boundary where the living world shades into something that is no longer living. And she is specifically, consistently, dangerous to the young woman who approaches that boundary without sufficient caution, without the right preparation, without understanding what it is she is approaching. Dundes framed this figure as a culturally reconfigured version of older pan-European belief, something that had been given many faces and many names and many local habitations across centuries, but that retained its essential shape across all of them. Owner. Mary Worth, in this reading, is one of the most recent faces worn by a figure who had been appearing in European and American folk tradition for a very long time before anyone in an Indiana town gave her that particular name. The question of how old this figure is leads somewhat unexpectedly to a particular book published in Germany in 1812. The brothers Grimm collected their tales across the German countryside, writing down stories that had been circulating in oral tradition for generations before they put them to paper. And among those tales was one that contained, at its center, a mirror of a particular kind. The evil queen in Snow White does not simply own a mirror. She is bound to it. She consults it. She asks it questions, and it answers her, and the answers it gives are the most important information in her world. The mirror in that story is not a passive surface. It is a living thing, or something like a living thing, with the capacity to perceive and to speak and to know things that ordinary sight cannot access. Folklorist Maria Tatar, in her work on the Grimm tales, was careful to distinguish between what the brothers Grimm invented and what they recorded, and the enchanted mirror in Snow White is, according to her analysis, not an invention. It is a transcription. The mirror that knows things, the mirror that can be consulted, the mirror that has a voice and a will of its own. These are features that appear in living Germanic and Central European folk belief, not merely in the literary imagination of two brothers in the early 19th century. The Grimm tale is a crystallization of something that was already in the culture, already circulating, already believed in some form by people who did not read fairy tale collections because they were themselves the source of them. The specific quality of the evil queen's mirror that matters most for the purposes of understanding Mary Worth is not that it can speak, it is that it is connected to a woman whose relationship to ordinary feminine life has gone wrong in some fundamental way. The evil queen is a stepmother, which is its own particular category of female wrongness in fairy tale logic. She is vain and powerful, and without the softening quality that the stories associate with correct femininity. And her mirror reflects all of this back. It is her instrument, her connection, the physical object through which her distorted relationship to the world operates. The mirror is hers because she is the kind of woman she is. And the kind of woman she is the kind who does not fit where she should fit, who exceeds her proper dimensions, who reaches into spaces that the stories have designated as not hers to reach into. This is not, it turns out, a feature unique to the Grimm tale. The same logic appears across a wide range of 19th century British folklore as well, in collections that were assembled not as literary entertainment, but as documentary records of what rural and working class communities actually believed. William Henderson published notes on the folklore of the northern counties of England and the borders in 1866, and among the many things he documented were legends attached to specific mirrors in specific households, legends in which the glass had acquired a kind of supernatural residue from something that had happened in its presence. The most common pattern in these accounts involves a woman who died at or near a particular mirror, especially a woman who died violently or unjustly or in a state of unresolved grief or rage. The death in these legends does not simply end. Something of it stays in the glass. The mirror continues to hold the moment of the death, or the face of the woman at the moment of the death, visible under the right conditions to those who know how to look. John Harland and T.T. Wilkinson documented similar material the following year in their collection of Lancashire folklore, where the same logic operates. A woman died badly in the presence of this mirror, and the mirror remembers. The glass holds something of her, not the woman herself, and not exactly her ghost in the ordinary sense, but a trace, a residue, an image that the normal processes of reflection did not clear away when she died. It is still there, in the mirror, waiting for the conditions under which it becomes visible again. The pattern in these Victorian collections is remarkably consistent. The woman must have died badly, not peacefully, not of old age in a comfortable bed, but badly, in a way that was either violent or unjust or unresolved. The quality of the death matters. A woman who died content and at peace does not leave her face in the glass. It is specifically the wrongness of the death, the incompleteness of it, the fact that something remained unfinished, that creates the condition for the trace to persist. The mirror becomes a record of a particular kind of female experience, the experience of having something done to you that should not have been done, and having no recourse in ordinary life to address it. This is the thing that Mary Worth shares with these Victorian Lancashire legends. It is the thing that connects her to the unnamed women whose faces might still be visible in Henderson's northern county mirrors. She too died badly. She too died in a way that was wrong, accused, condemned, executed for something that the folk tradition treats, at minimum, ambiguously, and she too came back. The return is not random, It is specifically organized around the wrongness of the death. The violence that was done to her is what gives her the capacity to come back through the glass, and what comes back through the glass is not peaceful or reconciled. It is the shape of what was not resolved. Across these different accounts and collections, the figure in the mirror is almost never described as frightening in the way that a pure monster is frightening. She is not simply a dangerous thing that attacks randomly. She is something more specific than that, something that the children who performed the Bloody Mary ritual seemed, in their accounts to Langlois, to understand intuitively, even if they couldn't articulate it in those terms. She is a woman who has a claim, not on the world in general, not on everyone who walks past a mirror, but specifically on the young women who come to the threshold and call for her. The ritual creates a kind of invitation, and what makes the invitation possible is that the woman on the other side of the glass is not a random spirit, but one with a particular history of connection to exactly this kind of moment, a young woman, a mirror, a darkened room, the calling of a name. The same figure, carrying the same essential qualities, appears in a different cultural context entirely, on the other side of the world from Lancashire and Indiana. And the way this figure connects to the Bloody Mary tradition is one of the more interesting convergences that folklore scholarship has documented in recent decades. La Llorona, the Weeping Woman, is one of the oldest and most widely distributed legends in Latin American oral tradition. Her story is known across Mexico, Central America, and the American Southwest, and in its most common form it goes like this. A woman, beautiful and desperate, drowned her own children in a river, and in doing so condemned herself to wander the earth forever, searching for them at the edges of water, calling out for them in the dark. Her cry is the identifying feature of her legend, a high, grieving wail heard near rivers and streams at night, especially near the places where children play near water, especially near the places where the living world meets the moving water that in folk tradition so often marks the boundary between worlds. La Llorona is ancient. The legend is documented in Spanish colonial sources from the 16th century, and most scholars of Mexican folk tradition believe those documents were recording something that was already old when the Spanish arrived. She belongs to a deep layer of indigenous and colonial and mestizo belief, a figure who encodes anxieties about motherhood, about loss, about the violence that colonial society did to indigenous women and families, about the consequences of transgression. She is not a witch, not a crone, not exactly the same figure as Mary Worth, but she lives in the same neighborhood of the folk imagination. She too is a woman who died badly. She too is a woman whose death left something unresolved and terrible. She too is especially dangerous to children, and she too inhabits the liminal places, the edges between the ordinary world and whatever lies past the edge. Domino Renee Perez, in her 2008 study of La Llorona, documented something that takes a moment to absorb properly. In communities where both the La Llorona legend and the Bloody Mary ritual circulate, particularly in communities along the United States-Mexico border and in cities with significant Mexican-American populations, the two figures do not remain separate. They merge. Children in these communities recounting the Bloody Mary ritual describe the figure in the mirror in ways that are unmistakably La Llorona, a weeping woman, a woman searching for her lost children, a woman whose sorrow has curdled into danger over the long centuries of her wandering. And children recounting La Llorona legends describe her appearing in mirrors, summoned by the saying of a name in a darkened room, visible in the glass in exactly the conditions of the Bloody Mary ritual. This is not a confusion. It is not an error. It is folklore doing what folklore has always done, which is to recognize structural similarity and allow structurally similar figures to flow together where their edges touch. The children who described La Llorona appearing in the Bloody Mary mirror had not mixed up two separate legends through carelessness. They had recognized that both legends described the same shape in different clothing and allowed the clothing to become interchangeable. The shape is this: a woman who died in a state of profound wrong, whose death did not release her, who exists at the threshold between the living world and whatever is past the threshold, and who can be reached from the living side by a young woman who knows the right conditions and is willing to stand at the mirror and call. The specific woman varies, the specific wrong varies, the specific name varies, but the shape is consistent, and the shape is very old. To sit with all of these figures, Mary Worth in her old clothes, the unnamed women of the Lancashire mirrors, the evil queen bound to her speaking glass, the weeping woman at the edge of the water, is to notice something that is easy to overlook when any one of them is considered alone. None of them are simple. None of them are purely threatening in the way that a natural disaster or a wild animal is threatening. All of them are, in some fundamental way, about something that was done to a woman and did not end when it should have ended. The violence, the injustice, the loss, these are the engine of the figure in every tradition, the thing that keeps her present and dangerous across all the years and all the versions and all the different names she has been given. The mirror is not incidental to any of these figures. In every tradition in which they appear, the mirror is the specific technology of their presence, not a window, not a door, not an open body of water. The water comes close. The mirror, the thing that shows you your own face, and under the right conditions shows you something else instead. The thing that is always at the boundary between what is real and what is reflected, between the face that is yours and the face that the glass produces in the gap where yours was. Every one of these figures lives in that gap, in the space where the reflection should be you and is not. The mirror's role in the legend makes a particular kind of sense when the figures are held together like this. These are women who were defined by what they were denied: recognition, justice, continued life, the ordinary passage from living to dead without being held at the threshold. The mirror is the instrument of recognition, the thing that says, yes, this face is real, this person exists, this woman is here, and the legend says again and again, in different languages and different centuries, the woman in the mirror is not gone. She is in the glass, in the place where recognition happens, refusing to be not seen, waiting for the moment when someone stands close enough and holds still long enough for the glass to show her instead. There is a particular detail in the British Victorian collections that seems on first encounter to be merely a regional peculiarity, but that opens up considerably when it is placed alongside the broader pattern. In some of these accounts, the mirror in which a dead woman's face might be seen is described not simply as the mirror that was in the room when she died, but as the mirror in front of which she stood most often in her life, the mirror she looked into most frequently, the mirror she had the longest relationship with. The haunting is not random, it is organized around intimacy and habitual use. The mirror that holds her is the one she chose, or the one that became hers by long association, the one that saw her face most often in life, and is therefore, by the logic of the legend, most deeply marked by it. This detail does something interesting to the idea of the haunted mirror. It makes the haunting personal rather than mechanical. It is not simply that any mirror can hold a dead woman's face if the conditions are right. It is that this mirror holds this woman's face because she and the mirror had a history together. The glass remembers her specifically, the way a place can seem to remember the person who spent most time in it. The haunting is a form of fidelity. Strange as that sounds, a refusal on the part of the mirror to behave as though the woman is simply gone because the woman is gone. Janet Langloss's Mary Worth operates in a slightly different mode, because the ritual moves the mirror from a fixed location to a portable instrument that can be any mirror, anywhere, as long as the conditions are correct. The candle, the darkness, the repetition of the name, these are the conditions that transform an ordinary bathroom mirror into the mirror that Mary Worth lives in. The transformation is temporary, available to any participant who correctly reproduces the conditions, and it implies a different understanding of how the woman in the mirror works. She is not attached to one specific glass. She is attached to a specific set of circumstances, and any glass that reproduces those circumstances becomes, for the duration of the ritual, the glass through which she can be reached. This is a subtle shift, but it is worth noting. The Victorian legends describe mirrors that have been made permanently strange by a specific event. The Bloody Mary ritual describes a woman who can be made present anywhere, in any mirror, by anyone who knows the formula. The first is a haunting, the second is a summoning, and the difference between them reflects a broader shift in how the figure in the mirror is understood, not as a remnant of a specific death in a specific place, but as a persistent presence that can be called to any location, because she is, in some sense, already everywhere that the threshold condition exists. She is not haunting one particular mirror, she is inhabiting the mirror state itself, the condition of standing before a reflective surface in the dark and holding still, which can be reproduced anywhere and therefore can produce her anywhere. The word summoning matters here because it implies that the person performing the ritual has some degree of agency in what happens, that the presence of Mary Worth is not simply an accident of geography, but something the participant has actively brought about. The children Langloss interviewed understood this, even the youngest ones. They were not simply describing a haunted location that might be stumbled upon accidentally. They were describing a procedure, a repeatable set of actions that would reliably produce a result. The dare structure of the ritual, the fact that it is framed as a test of courage, something one person challenges another to do, depends entirely on this understanding. It would not be a dare if the result were not expected to occur. The whole thing is built on the shared assumption that if you do it right, something will happen. The something that was expected to happen varied, in the accounts Langloss collected, from the relatively mild, a face appearing in the glass, the reflection doing something it should not do, to the more dramatic, scratched faces, dragged through the glass, visited later, in dreams or in the dark, by something that had been disturbed by the summoning. The escalating nature of these accounts follows a pattern that Bill Ellis identified in his work on legend performance, in which the social function of the story requires that each account be slightly more extreme than the last, each reported experience slightly more convincing of the figure's reality and danger, because the social reward for performing the ritual successfully goes to the one who came closest to genuine contact. But underneath the escalation, underneath the competitive layer of whose experience was most extreme, the figure at the center of it all remains the same: a woman who died badly, a woman who is angry about it, a woman who exists at the threshold in the glass and who can be reached by someone willing to stand there and call. The question of why the figure in the mirror is almost always female is one that the folklore scholarship approaches carefully, because the answer points towards something that is more than a curiosity of distribution. Alan Dundas's analysis connects this to the pan-European crone archetype and its particular association with femininity and liminality, the historical and mythological tendency in many cultures to associate women with thresholds, transitions, and the spaces between known states. The midwife, the wise woman, the mourner, the witch, all of these are figures defined in part by their occupation of the edges of ordinary life, the moments when one condition ends and another begins. The woman in the mirror is the most extreme form of this association, a female figure occupying the most liminal surface imaginable, the threshold between the real face and its reflection, between the world of the living and whatever is on the other side of the glass. The fact that the ritual was documented predominantly among pre-adolescent girls is not coincidental in the analysis Langlois and others offer. The slumber party setting, the group of girls in their early adolescence, the darkened bathroom, the single candle, these are not arbitrary. They form a particular social context, a particular stage of life in which questions about female identity, female danger, and what awaits a young woman as she moves toward adulthood are psychologically urgent in ways they may not be later. The figure in the mirror is a woman who has passed through something terrible. The young women calling her to the glass are standing at the beginning of their own passage. There is something in the ritual that is not simply a dare, something that is closer to an inquiry, an attempt to make contact with a knowledge that exists on the other side of an experience the participants have not yet had. The figure called does not, in any of the accounts, provide comfort or guidance. She provides fright. She scratches faces. She stares. She comes through the glass and does damage. But the fright is the point, in some sense, or at least an acceptable outcome of the inquiry. The young women who perform the ritual already know or suspect that the knowledge on the other side of the threshold is not comfortable knowledge. The ritual is not asking for reassurance. It is asking for contact, for the specific recognition that comes from having stood at the boundary and looked at what is there. Mary Worth in Langlois' fieldwork is described by almost every child who mentions her as wearing old clothes. This detail appears again and again across different accounts, different states, different decades. Old clothes, the kind from a long time ago. This is not a detail about the specific historical period to which Mary Worth belongs. The accounts are vague on that point, and the period shifts between telling but about the quality of distance she represents. She is from another time. She is from before. She is from a time when the wrong that was done to her was possible in a way that the children telling the story locate, with some imprecision, in the past. And she is still here, in the glass, in the old clothes, not having moved on in any of the ways that the living are supposed to move on. The old clothes are a form of temporal liminality, matching her spatial liminality. She is not from this time, and she is not from the other side of the glass in any simple way either. She is from a particular point of arrest, the moment of her death, which was also the moment of her return, and from which she has not moved. Her clothing marks that moment as visibly as a clock stopped at the instant of a disaster. She is fixed at her own wrong ending, held there by the incompleteness of what was done to her. And from that fixed point, she is capable of reaching through the glass into any present that calls for her correctly. What is perhaps most interesting about all of these figures taken together is how little they require of the person who encounters them. Mary Worth does not ask to be believed in. La Llorona does not ask to be understood. The women in the Victorian mirrors do not ask to be mourned. They ask, if they ask anything, only to be seen, to be met at the threshold by someone willing to stand there and look. The whole structure of the ritual, the candle, the darkness, the repetition of the name, The willingness to stay in the room until something happens is a structure for standing still and looking at what is in the glass. Whatever else the ritual is, it is an act of sustained attention directed at a surface that the ordinary world treats as purely functional, purely reflective, purely a tool for seeing one's own face and moving on. The woman in the mirror has no use for the ordinary function of the glass. She does not need to check her appearance. She has been in there long enough that appearances are no longer her concern. What she needs, in the logic of every version of the legend, is the attention itself, the standing still, the holding of the gaze, the willingness to wait in the dark until the glass shows something true, or at least something that feels like it. There is an old shape to this, older than Mary Worth, older than the Lancashire mirrors, older than the Brothers Grimm, goes as far back as any record of what human beings have done with reflective surfaces, which is to use them not only to see themselves, but to see something past themselves, something on the other side of the surface, something that the ordinary world keeps behind the glass, and that requires a particular combination of conditions to make visible. The woman in the mirror is the most recent version of that something. She has a name and a story, and a set of old clothes, and a specific injustice attached to her. But the impulse that calls her to the glass is the same one that called every version of her, going back further than any specific story can follow. Some shapes in folklore seem to grow back. They are given new names, new histories, new faces, new specific grievances, and they fill those new forms completely and become fully real in them, and the new form is not a lesser version of the old form. It is the old form fully inhabited in the present. Mary Worth, in an Indiana bathroom, is not a pale copy of something that was once more genuine. She is the thing itself in its current form, as present and as specific as she has ever been in any form. The shape that fills her is ancient, and the filling of it is always happening now, in whatever dark room a young woman is willing to stand in, holding a candle, looking at the glass, waiting for the face in the mirror to become something other than her own. Two girls at a slumber party, somewhere in a border town in the 1990s, are telling stories. One of them is telling a Bloody Mary story, and one of them is telling a La Llorona story, and at some point in the telling, the stories arrive at the same place, the same darkened room, the same mirror, the same woman on the other side of the glass, held there by the same incompleteness, reaching through the same surface toward the same young face, looking in at her from the living side. The two girls stop. They notice this. They are not confused by it. They are simply present with the fact that both of their stories ended up here, that the two women they were describing turned out to be standing in the same doorway. This is what folklore does when it is working as it has always worked. Finds the shape in all its many named forms and holds them next to each other until the shape becomes visible, patient and old, and entirely indifferent to the particular name that any one tradition has given it. In the year 1804, a Swiss physician named Ignaz Paul Vital Troxler was sitting very still, holding his gaze fixed on a single point and watching the world quietly disappear. Not all at once, not dramatically. The edges went first. Whatever occupied the periphery of his visual field, the soft shapes of furniture, the walls of the room, the ambient detail that surrounds any fixed point, began to soften and then to blur and then to simply withdraw, as though the world had decided that whatever lay outside the narrow channel of his focus was not strictly necessary. He held his gaze. The effect deepened. The surrounding visual field did not go dark, so much as it went absent, replaced by a kind of neutral nowhere that was not darkness and not light. At the center, the fixed point remained, Everything else had in the quietest possible way ceased. What Troxler had found, in a room that was probably an ordinary room, at an hour that was probably an ordinary hour, with no instruments other than his own careful attention, was that the visual system does not hold the world steady. It holds the center steady, the periphery. When it receives no new information, when the eyes do not move and the stimulus does not change, will gradually fade from conscious perception altogether. The brain, having noted that nothing at the edge is changing, reassigns its resources. The unchanging peripheral world is effectively discarded. The system conserves itself. The effect is named for him now, and it has been studied extensively in the 2 centuries since he sat in that room and noticed the world withdrawing from the corners of his eyes. And every study has confirmed the same basic finding: a still gaze, a fixed point, a stable and unchanging surround, and the edges of perception will begin slowly and without urgency to dissolve. This is the first of several things happening in the darkened bathroom. The bathroom is small and warm, or it is cool, or it is neither. The candle has been placed on the edge of the sink. The door has been closed. The electric light is off. The remains is a room that is mostly darkness, with a small warm column of light rising from the candle, and in the mirror above the sink, a reflected column of light rising in the opposite direction, down toward the basin in the reverse geometry of the glass. The face of the person standing before the mirror is lit from below, which is not the angle at which faces are ordinarily lit, and the features that would catch overhead light most naturally, the top of the nose, the brow ridge, the upper lip, are now in shadow, while the chin and the hollow of the cheekbones and the lower rim of each eye socket are the brightest points. The face is already, in some small way, unfamiliar. Now the gaze fixes. The ritual requires a fixed gaze. The chanting is directed at the mirror, and the eyes, following the voice, follow the reflection. The reflection stands still. The peripheral field of vision, which now includes the darker surround of the mirror's frame, the shadows at the edge of the room, the indistinct shapes of towel hooks and cabinet corners, and the back wall's unlit plane, begins to receive the same unchanging information, second after second. The brain, following a process Troxler identified more than 200 years ago, begins to reallocate. The edges soften. The dark shapes at the periphery lose their definition. The mirror's reflection fills a greater and greater proportion of what is consciously perceived, not because the mirror has grown, but because the rest of the room has quietly receded. The face in the mirror is the only stable object in the narrowing visual world, and then the face begins to change. It does not begin to change because of anything supernatural. It begins to change because of what happens when a face recognition system that evolved over millions of years to detect tiny changes in human expression is asked to stare at the same face in the same low light without moving for longer than faces are ever stared at under normal conditions. The system is calibrated for movement, for change, for the flickering subtle alteration of expression that distinguishes a living face from an inert one. A face that does not change, held in fixed gaze under conditions of reduced illumination, does not register as more stable than a changing one. It registers as wrong. In 2010, an Italian psychologist named Giovanni Caputo published the results of an experiment that in retrospect seems almost absurdly simple. 50 participants were asked to sit in a dimly lit room, alone, and gaze at their own reflection in a mirror for 10 minutes. The room was lit at a level Caputo described as low, but sufficient to make the reflected face clearly visible. No candles, no chanting, No social context of dread or expectation, just a person, a chair, a mirror, and 10 minutes of quiet. At the end of the 10 minutes, the participants described what they had seen in the mirror. The results were not subtle. 66% of participants reported seeing a deformed face in the mirror, a face that appeared distorted, asymmetrical, or wrong in ways they could not precisely name. 48% reported seeing the face of a stranger, a face that did not belong to them, a face they did not recognize, looking back from where their own reflection should have been. 28% reported seeing what they described as an archetypal face, an old woman, a young child, a relative who had died, a figure that carried some quality of deep familiarity combined with the clear understanding that it was not them. Several participants reported that the stranger's face appeared to shift or to have an independent expression, to be doing something with its mouth or eyes that the participant's own face was not doing. The room had been ordinary. The mirror had been ordinary. No ritual structure had been supplied, no expectation of strangeness, no group of friends pressing close to a closed door. The only conditions present were dim light, a fixed gaze, and 10 minutes of uninterrupted stillness. And in those conditions, without any additional scaffolding, more than half of the people present stopped seeing their own face. Caputo called this the strange face illusion, and he went on to study it further. What he proposed in subsequent research was that the experience arises from a specific kind of dissociation between two visual processes that normally work in close coordination. The first process operates at a low level. It is the part of the visual system that detects change, that monitors the incoming signal for anything new or different, that keeps the brain informed about whether the visual environment is stable or shifting. The second process operates at a higher level. It is the part that recognizes faces, that maps a seen face onto stored templates of known people, that produces the immediate recognition of a familiar face that is normally so automatic as to be invisible. Under ordinary conditions, these two systems agree. The face in the mirror changes slightly as the viewer moves, the expression shifts, the light varies, and the change detection system provides a constant stream of updated information that the face recognition system uses to confirm its identification. Under the conditions of the Bloody Mary ritual, the agreement breaks down. The low-level change detection system, receiving a face that is staying almost completely still in dim and flickering light, begins to amplify whatever small changes are present, the candle's subtle movement, the tiny involuntary micro-movements of the viewer's own eyes, the gradual fade of peripheral detail as Troxler's effect deepens. It is doing its job. It is reporting change, but the changes it is reporting are not the ordinary changes of a face being its own face in ordinary light. They are partial, unstable, and ambiguous. The high-level face recognition system, receiving this degraded and unstable input, searches its templates for a match. The match it finds grows progressively less certain. The features keep shifting before the identification can be confirmed. The system, working hard to do the thing it always does, produces its best available answer, a face, or something organized like a face, assembled from whatever input it has, and that assembled face is not quite the viewer's own. It is, from the inside, genuinely experienced as separate and external. This is not a matter of self-deception or wishful thinking or metaphor. The face that appears in the mirror in these conditions is processed by the brain in the same way that any face is processed, as a real face out there in the world, looking back. The subjective experience is not one of imagining a different face, it is one of perceiving one. This is a detail worth holding for a moment. The strangeness of the Bloody Mary ritual's reported effects has often been framed as a product of imagination, in the slightly dismissive sense of that word, as children frightening themselves, as the mind playing tricks on a credulous participant. What Caputo's research suggests is something more precise and more interesting than that. The face in the mirror is genuinely perceived. The visual system is not malfunctioning. It is functioning exactly as it is built to function, under conditions to which it was never adapted, producing the most coherent output it can from insufficient and unstable input. The output happens to be a stranger's face, but the process that produced it is the same process that produces every reliable, accurate, undramatic identification of a face that the visual system makes. Two psychologists named Leonard Zusny and Warren Jones published a book in 1982 called Anomalistic Psychology, which was a careful and thorough examination of the conditions under which ordinary human perception produces experiences that the people having them interpret as paranormal. What Zusny and Jones found, across a very wide survey of documented cases, was that genuine perceptual hallucinations, experiences that feel fully real, that are not recognized as internal by the person having them, that produce the same quality of conviction as normal perception, are not rare in otherwise normal people. They require a specific combination of conditions. Zusny and Jones identified three that recurred consistently: suggestion, expectation, and reduced sensory input. Suggestion is the state of having been told that something might happen, not a vague sense that strangeness is possible, but a specific and socially reinforced prediction. This is what you might see. This is what others have seen. This is what you are about to look for. Expectation is the internal state that suggestion produces, the mental preparation for a specific experience, the preloading of the perceptual system with a template of what is expected. And reduced sensory input is the condition in which the nervous system, deprived of its normal volume of incoming information, begins to generate its own. Sensory deprivation research has shown this effect clearly. The brain does not rest when input falls below a threshold. It fills the gap. What it fills the gap with tends to be organized by whatever expectations are most active. All three of these conditions are structurally built into the Bloody Mary ritual as it has been documented and practiced. The suggestion is supplied by the social context, the story that has been told before the ritual begins, the instructions that specify what to expect, the testimony of others who have done it before and described what they saw. The expectation is carried into the bathroom with the participant, a specific template preloaded in the face recognition system before the mirror is ever faced, and the reduced sensory input is provided by the darkened room, the single candle, the absence of ambient noise in a closed bathroom, and the fixed gaze held on a still reflection by the requirements of the ritual itself. This is not a coincidence. The ritual, however old its roots and however many names it has carried across the centuries it has been practiced, has arrived at a form that supplies all three necessary conditions in the most reliable possible combination. Whether this form was arrived at deliberately, whether some early practitioner of mirror divination recognized, in experiential if not theoretical terms, that this combination worked, or whether it arrived through a long and largely unconscious process of selection, in which versions that reliably produced experiences survived and versions that did not were quietly dropped, is not something the historical record can settle. What the record shows is the result, a ritual structure that, when followed, will almost certainly produce what it promises. There is one more element that Zusny and Jones's framework did not fully address, because their primary frame of reference was individual psychology, and the Bloody Mary ritual is almost never performed alone. A folklorist named Bill Ellis studied the social dynamics of rituals of this kind in depth, and what he documented added a dimension to the picture that the purely individual account leaves incomplete. The ritual is performed at slumber parties, in school bathrooms, in groups. One person goes in, the others wait. The waiting group is not passive. It is a concentrated social environment in a state of shared heightened arousal. The specific combination of collective anticipation, suppressed noise, and mutual attention that a group of pre-adolescent girls in a darkened hallway produces while pressing close to a closed door to listen. This group has a shared expectation, it has a shared template, and it has a social stake in what the person inside the bathroom is about to report. Bill Ellis noted that the report the participant gives on emerging, the description of what was seen or felt or heard, is not simply a recollection of a private experience. It is a social performance, and it takes place in a social context that actively shapes it. The group's response, the leaning forward, the gasped reaction, the confirmation that this is consistent with what others have reported, is itself a form of feedback. The description sharpens as it is told. Details that produce the strongest response are elaborated. The experience is narrated into its final form in real time, partly in response to the faces of the people listening. This is not dishonesty, which is the ordinary and largely unconscious process by which human beings make sense of ambiguous experiences in social context, by speaking them aloud to other people and watching what happens to those other people as they listen. What this means in practice is that the group's shared expectation, conveyed before the ritual through the telling of what others have seen, is not just a factor in what the participant experiences inside the bathroom, it is also a factor in what the participant reports having experienced. The experience and the account of the experience are not two separate things with a clean boundary between them. They are two stages of a single process, and the social context operates across both. This is not a dismissal of the experience. The face in the mirror was genuinely seen. The sensation of standing in a dark room in front of a glass that appears to show a stranger looking back is, by all documented account, genuinely arresting. Not a mild intellectual interest, but a physical response, a small flood of the body's alarm system, a real quickening of the heartbeat, and a real sharpening of attention. The brain's face recognition system, producing a face that does not belong to the person standing in front of the mirror, does not also helpfully supply the information that this face is a product of the visual system's behavior under low light conditions. It supplies a face. The face is experienced as present, and the body responds to presence. Caputo described his participants, after the 10 minutes of gazing were complete, as reporting a state he called derealization, a mild and temporary sense of the world being slightly less solid and familiar than it normally is, a thin quality of unreality in the room and in the reflected face, a loosening of the ordinary certainty that things are where and what they appear to be. In participants who had found the experience unsettling, this state persisted for a few minutes after the experiment ended. In participants who found it interesting rather than distressing, it resolved more quickly. What determined which category a participant fell into was not what they had seen. The reported experiences did not differ significantly between the two groups. What determined it was what they had expected to see, and what frame they had been given for interpreting what happened. This is, in a compact and somewhat striking form, the entire structure of the Bloody Mary ritual, rendered as laboratory finding. The experience itself is perceptual and real. The meaning assigned to it is supplied by the context in which it occurs. The context is, among other things, a group of children in a hallway at midnight, having told each other a story about a woman who appears in mirrors when summoned. That context tells the participant what the strange face is, not a product of a well-studied optical phenomenon, not the visual system's best guess under conditions of reduced input, the woman in the mirror, the one they called for. There is something to be said about the candlelight specifically, because it is not incidental to the effect, and it is not simply a matter of atmosphere, and because Troxler's fading is only one of the several things the candlelight does to the face in the mirror. Candlelight flickers. It does so because the flame is not a sealed combustion. It is an open one sensitive to every small current of air in the room, to the warmth rising from the person standing near it, to the tiny vibrations transmitted through the floor when someone shifts their weight. The flicker is irregular rather than rhythmic. It does not pulse at a steady rate. It varies in amplitude, sometimes barely perceptible, sometimes a visible bend of the flame that throws the light sideways for a moment before it straightens. Each flicker produces a small change in the lighting of the face in the mirror. A shadow deepens for a fraction of a second on the left side of the nose. The chin catches more light, then less. The hollow of the eye socket fills briefly and then returns to shadow. These changes are too small and too fast for the face recognition system to track as coherent information about expression or identity. What they produce instead is instability, the impression that the face is in some indeterminate motion, not moving exactly, but not quite still either. The low-level change detection system, which was already receiving ambiguous input from the Troxler effect, now has a new source of ambiguity to process. The high-level face recognition system, which was already working with a degraded signal, now has a face that appears to be shifting faster than a face should shift without moving. The two systems' disagreement deepens. The stranger's face, or the deformed face, or the archetypal face, resolves more quickly and more fully than it might under perfectly steady illumination, because the perfectly steady illumination never arrives. This is why the candle is specified, not symbolically. Not only symbolically, the candle placed at chin height on the edge of the sink produces exactly the quality of light that makes the visual system most uncertain about the face it is seeing, and it does so continuously and irregularly throughout the duration of the ritual. A strong overhead electric light would produce a face that the visual system could track and identify reliably. Even a low electric light, if steady, would provide enough stability for the face recognition system to maintain its identification. The candle, being what it is, open, variable, responding to the breath and weight and presence of the person standing before it, produces the precise quality of illumination that undermines that identification most efficiently. The person who first specified a candle did not know any of this. They knew that a candle worked. Zusne and Jones's third condition, reduced sensory input, operates along several channels simultaneously in the ritual bathroom, and it is worth being specific about all of them. The visual channel is reduced by darkness and made unstable by candlelight. The auditory channel is reduced by the closed door and the ambient silence of a late hour. The tactile and proprioceptive channels are reduced by stillness. The ritual requires standing in one place, which over a period of several minutes begins to produce a mild sensory monotony, a quieting of the positional feedback that ordinarily provides a constant background sense of the body occupying space. The olfactory channel is altered by the candle itself, which produces a thin smell of warm wax, and whatever the candle is made of, a smell that is associated with enclosed ritual space in a range of traditions, and that is specific enough to be worth noting as a contextual cue. All of these reductions compound each other. No single one of them is sufficient to produce a genuine perceptual hallucination in an alert and well-rested person under ordinary expectations. Together, in combination with suggestion and expectation, they bring the nervous system to the threshold at which its own generative activity begins to fill what the external world is no longer providing. And at that threshold, what the face recognition system produces from a poorly lit mirror and a face held still for several minutes longer than faces are meant to be held still is the face that the participant was told to expect. There is one more level to this, which is the level of development. The Bloody Mary ritual is documented overwhelmingly as a practice of pre-adolescent and early adolescent girls, typically between the ages of 9 and 13. This is not a coincidence either, though the reasons are interesting rather than obvious. The face recognition system undergoes significant development during adolescence. In younger children, the system is not yet fully calibrated, particularly for faces that fall outside the immediate social environment. The ability to distinguish between faces of people from unfamiliar ethnic backgrounds, the ability to read subtle expressions reliably, the ability to identify a known face under degraded or altered conditions. These capacities are still developing and consolidating in the 9 to 13 age range. This means that the face in the mirror is, in a technical sense, already slightly harder for this age group to identify with full certainty than it would be for an adult. The baseline identification is marginally less stable. The Troxler effect and the candlelight are working on a system that is already in a somewhat less robust state of calibration than it will be in adulthood. This does not mean that adults are immune to the strange face illusion. Caputo's participants were adults, and more than half of them saw a stranger's face within 10 minutes. It means that the ritual age group may be particularly well positioned to find the experience reliable, to encounter the strange face quickly and fully, to have the experience resolve in the way the ritual promises it will, and to return to the group waiting in the hallway with a report that is vivid and complete. Bill Ellis noted another function of the ritual that belongs at this level of the picture. For pre-adolescent girls specifically, the Bloody Mary ritual functions as a structured experiment in transgression, a safe test of the boundary between the acceptable and the forbidden, performed in a group context that provides both permission and witness. The dare to go into the bathroom alone is a social event as much as a perceptual one. The courage required is real. The status conferred on returning and reporting is real. The bond produced by shared participation in a ritual that carries mild risk, even a risk that is understood, at some level, to be not entirely serious, is real. This context does not explain away the experience. It extends the picture of what the experience is. The strange face in the mirror is one event. The entire ritual, the telling beforehand, the decision to go in, the closed door, the darkness, the minutes alone, the return, the report, the group's response is another and larger event, and the two are not separable. The perceptual experience happens inside the social ritual. It is shaped by the social ritual, and it is understood, interpreted, and remembered through the frame that the social ritual provides. What the social ritual provides, in its most basic structure, is this: a story to explain the face. Not just any story, a story that has been tested across decades of practice and refined by circulation through the social networks of children who tell it to each other at slumber parties and in school hallways, and across neighborhoods where no one has read the academic literature, and no one has heard of Giovanni Caputo, and no one knows the name Troxler. The story works because the face appears. The face appears because of everything that Troxler and Caputo and Zuzne and Jones have documented. And so the story, which is old and has worn many names and has traveled through many forms, persists not because children are credulous or because the supernatural has intervened, but because the story and the phenomenon it describes are genuinely matched. The face appears in the mirror. The story says the face will appear in the mirror. These two facts reinforce each other through every iteration, and the ritual continues. A bathroom mirror in an empty house does something very ordinary when no one is standing in front of it. It holds a dark rectangle of reflected wall. It holds, if there is a window somewhere in its line of reflection, a small pale square of night sky. It holds the outline of whatever is behind it, the edge of a cabinet door, the chrome of a faucet, the white plane of the ceiling, rendered in the mirror's slightly flattened way, a fraction more still than the things it reflects. This is what mirrors do when they are left alone. They carry a reversed and slightly compressed version of whatever is in front of them. When nothing is in front of them, they carry the room. The face recognition system, turning toward a mirror in the dark, produces what it produces. Troxler's effect deepens the darkness at the edges and narrows the field. The candlelight shifts and the shadow on the chin shifts with it, and the mouth appears to move without moving,